Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a very specific look at a stack of sources. These are excerpts from writings by Dr. Murad Agha from back in 2009, maybe early 2010.
That's right. And these sources, well, they give us a really particular and often quite passionate perspective on the state of the Arab world as he saw it over a decade ago.
Yeah, sharp critiques, right? History, challenges.
And even, potential futures seen through religious prophecy. It's quite a mix.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack this distinctive viewpoint. We want to understand the key things Dr. Agha was saying back then, highlight his critiques, the history he brings in, and some pretty surprising insights he draws.
And we should be clear up front, right? This is about us agreeing with or endorsing every single idea here.
No, definitely not.
Our job is to guide you through what's actually in these sources, to understand this specific perspective from that specific time using, the author's own words and his framing.
Okay, let's dive in then. The source really kicks off with a powerful and honestly quite bleak assessment of the Arab world around 2009-2010.
Absolutely. There's a very strong condemnation right from the start. The author repeatedly describes Arab states as, fundamentally weak, fragmented entities.
He uses a specific term, doesn't he? Mutasarrifiyat.
Yeah, mutasarrifiyat, which essentially means like small administrative areas or prefectures. The implication is they lack real sovereignty, or inherent dignity.
And the critique points very directly at the leaders, the regimes.
Oh, absolutely. In this view, they're seen as largely submissive to foreign powers. Their focus isn't really on the welfare of the people.
More on themselves.
Exactly. Self-preservation, personal gain. The language he uses is strong, describing it as a world of Arab oppression and depravity, or a world of humiliation and disgrace.
He really doesn't pull punches when it comes to, say, official attempts at Arab unity either.
Not at all. Any official initiatives, summits, things like that mentioned, they're dismissed as failures. Yeah, just posturing.
He has some colorful phrases for it.
He does. He talks about summits that neither solve nor tie, leaders with mocking beards. And he even makes this striking claim that Arab nationalism itself, as it emerged, was actually a foreign creation.
Foreign? Like who?
Authored by one composer, the English, he says, following the Arab revolt against the Ottomans.
Wow. Okay, that's a strong historical take right there, tied into the critique of the present. And this perspective also emphasizes the suffering of everyday people.
Yes, very much so. The source paints a really stark picture, the crushed masses, the tormented, plucked, thrown on the mat.
Grim stuff.
Yeah. It highlights major social issues, citing over 60 million Arabs unable to read at the time, high poverty, like 40% below the poverty line in Syria back then.
And human rights.
In this view, long gone. Entered Guinness for being forgotten, he says. He uses these really harsh metaphors, suggesting people are treated like cattle or even...
The shish tawuk one? That's jarring.
It really is. It underscores this sense of dehumanization presented in the source. And corruption, mismanagement that's central to this picture, too.
Like the aid for Gaza.
Yeah, he suggests aid intended for places like Gaza was effectively stolen. Using that vivid analogy, the stories of Alibaba and the 40 contractors thieves.
And he argues this isn't just about aid, but potentially vast amounts of wealth.
Exactly. The argument is that the wealth squandered or siphoned off from the Arab world is just immense.
Huge potential lost.
Right. He claims this wealth could have made the people among the richest globally, potentially surpassing incomes in, say, Scandinavia or Switzerland.
So a view of immense potential held back by leadership, by systems he sees as corrupt and subservient, and controlling the narrative, the media, seems key to maintaining this.
Yes, very much. The author talks about the psychology of propaganda, detailing how he sees media being used to control minds, hide truth.
Keep people distracted.
Keep people distracted with entertainment, with vice. There's this cynical encouragement he describes. Get high, ignore, spread out, live and thrive. Helped along by various institutions for get high till you pop.
And he brings in examples.
Yeah, historical and contemporary ones. Cities known for wine or hashish production, like Jerez in Spain, Zali in Lebanon. He sees them as symbols of this decline and distraction. He even speculatively links the name Jerez to an Arabic origin related to this.
That really paints a picture of decline on multiple levels, political, social, even cultural. Given this really critical view of the present, it's fascinating where he looks for comparison. He often brings up the Ottoman Empire.
He does. There's a clear admiration for the Ottoman period in these sources. He calls it the days of their era and glory, describing the glorious, lofty state of the Ottomans as a time of unity, strength.
Especially in defending lands.
Particularly in defending Muslim lands and holy sites, like Jerusalem. He notes they united the fragments of Arabdom, sometimes he says even by force, but he sees the result as positive compared to what came next.
And what came next, in his view, is the Arab Revolt, which gets a very different label, a negative one.
Very negative. It's called the Great Arab Cow. The source directly blames the revolt for fragmenting the region, leading straight to the current state of weakness and disunity he described.
So he draws a direct line.
Explicitly. He states the Arab world wouldn't be in its current shape if the Ottomans had kept their glory and might.
A direct link from perceived betrayal of the past to the fragmented present. But interestingly, the source does find a kind of modern echo of that past dignity.
Yes, he finds a glimmer, maybe, in modern Turkey under Erdogan at that time. Actions like condemning Israeli actions in Gaza, withdrawing parliamentarians from a friendship committee, threatening to stop dealings.
He saw that as positive.
He highlights these as embodying some of that former Ottoman dignity, a willingness to confront perceived injustice.
There's also that mention of a Turkish proverb. How does he use that?
It's quite interesting. The proverb goes, "A fire tongue cannot be made of wood, and a pasha cannot be made of an Arab." Yeah. But the author points to this saying and then explicitly hopes that contemporary Arabs, especially through resistance movements he mentions later, can actually prove this proverb wrong, show their capability and strength.
That historical lens really sharpens his critique of the present, doesn't it? And this critical view extends very powerfully to how he sees ongoing conflicts, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
It certainly does. The source frames Israel not just politically, but as a religious and ideological entity, built, he says, on a purely religious and ideological basis.
And linked to external support.
Absolutely. This entity, in the author's view, gets strong support from Western powers. He uses this metaphor of it being their major base and largest arms depots by proxy in the region.
He makes a point about motivations, too.
Yes, he suggests that even if Westerners might personally dislike Jews, their perceived enmity towards Islam leads them to support Israel anyway.
And he contrasts past military conflicts with more recent ones. He sees a shift there.
He does. He notes Israel's relatively easy victories against fragmented Arab armies in the past, like defeating 4 Arab armies in 6 days back in '67.
Right.
But he contrasts this sharply with the difficulties he perceives Israel facing more recently against organized Islamic resistance groups like Hamas and Hezbollah.
So the nature of the conflict changed, in his view.
In his framing, yes. It's no longer a simple Arab-Israeli conflict. It's evolved, he argues, into a global Islamic conflict with an organized ideological enemy.
And he's also extremely critical of the role of Arab regimes in all this.
Extremely. There's strong criticism for what he sees as complicity or implicit and explicit official Arab harmony with actions against Palestinians.
He gives an example.
He uses the example of the wall built between Sinai and Gaza by Egypt at the time. He views that as an Arab green light that, in his interpretation, effectively justifies similar barriers elsewhere, like the West Bank wall, in the eyes of international opinion.
That's a sharp accusation. What about that observation on the holy sites? That was a curious detail he included.
It is interesting. While he states Israel controls the Aqsa Mosque, the source points out that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, its keys are traditionally held by a Muslim family.
And why does he mention that?
He presents it as something that prevents sectarian Christian disputes over the site, and he highlights it as this interesting point of historical continuity.
And despite the criticism, he does see moments of strength, particularly with the Intifada of stones.
Yes, he talks about the Intifada of stones very positively, calls it a sign that entered history. He portrays it as a victory driven by God's will and the sheer determination of young people using simple stones against overwhelming military power.
Humbling the powerful.
Exactly. He sees it as humbling powerful figures and proving that will remains above all will. He even connects this event to a specific hadith, interpreting the phrase, "Jews are boys carried by God," as referring to this uprising.
That's a specific interpretation, connecting current events directly to prophecy. And speaking of cynical observations, he touches briefly on U.S. military bases.
It's briefly, but yeah, with a very cynical edge. He describes access to these bases as restricted not for regular folks, but specifically for suppliers of necessary services.
And he lists them.
He does, quite bitingly. Whiskey, hashish, entertainers, and dancers from various entertainment-focused institutions. It ties right back into his theme of distraction and vice being encouraged.
So, okay, we've heard a lot of critique A strong historical angle, a specific view of conflicts. It's a pretty bleak picture he paints overall. But does the source see any hope, any moments of dignity?
Yes, although the overall tone is quite negative, he does acknowledge some glimmers of resilience,
Where does he find those?
mainly in resistance movements. He specifically praises those in Lebanon back in 2006 and in Gaza around the time he was writing.
He sees strength there.
He sees these as instances where Arab capability and strength were actually shown. He credits these groups, often using just light weapons and simple equipment, with restoring confidence in the Arab person's ability to create the impossible.
And there's that specific anecdote, too, the one that seems to embody this dignity for him.
There is, yes. The story of Jamila Bouhired, the Algerian freedom fighter.
What about her?
The source highlights her refusal of any Arab or international aid when she was ill. He holds this up as a symbol of her profound dignity and pride,
Contrasting it with.
implicitly contrasting it with the perceived greed and lack of pride he attributes to many Arab leaders elsewhere in his writings.
That anecdote really stands out, doesn't it, against that backdrop of general critique. Okay, so we've covered the present critique, the historical view, the conflicts, those fleeting moments of resilience. But maybe the most unique part of this source material is its detailed look at the future, seen through the lens of religious prophecy.
Yeah, this section is definitely distinct. The source really dives deep into religious prophecies, drawing heavily from something called Kitab al-Fitan.
Which is?
Well, Kitab al-Fitan is basically a collection of hadith sayings
Yeah.
attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, but specifically focused on prophecies about the end times, major tribulations, that kind of thing.
And the author here, Dr. Agha, he treats these hadith not as symbolic stories, but as literal predictions.
Exactly. He approaches them as factual signs and indicators of the hour, the end times, things to be studied and understood literally as future events.
And he outlines a sequence.
He outlines a sequence of events described in one prophecy. It involves conflicts between different groups, referred to as black banners and yellow banners, fighting between people of the East and people of the West. It's quite detailed.
And where does the region of Syria, or Sham as he calls it, fit into this picture?
According to this interpretation presented in the source, Sham is absolutely central. After some of these other conflicts play out, a figure called the Sufyani emerges from Syria.
Okay.
Then the people of Sham follow, and they fight the people of the East. The source explicitly states that what he saw being planned for Sham back then, in 2009-2010, was a fierce war.
Which he believed would lead to something else.
Yes, which he believed would eventually be followed by good tidings when the people of Islam will gather.
He spends a surprising amount of time on one very specific prophecy. The Sayha, or Hada. What exactly is that?
Yes, this is where the source gets incredibly granular. The Sayha, or Hada, is described as this huge cry, or maybe a rumble, that's prophesied to occur in the middle of the month of Ramadan.
On a specific night.
On a Friday night, specifically in a year that has many earthquakes. The prophecy says this sound will wake anyone sleeping and terrify everyone else.
And he actually offers specific instructions on what people should do if or when this happens.
He does, based entirely on his interpretation of the prophecy. He details these protective measures after the dawn prayer, the Fajr prayer, on that specific Friday.
Yes.
You should go into your houses, close the doors, plug your ears, and if you sense the sound starting, you should immediately fall prostrate, face down, and repeat a specific supplication. Subhan al-Qudus, Rabbuna al-Qudus. Glory be to the Most Holy.
And doing this helps how?
He claims doing this ensures salvation, protection from whatever this event is.
That's incredibly specific advice, and he offers a very unique interpretation of what this sound actually is, doesn't he? Not the traditional view.
Right. This is where his interpretation really diverges. He explicitly argues this sound is not the voice of the angel Gabriel, which is what some traditional interpretations might suggest.
So what does he think it is?
He believes it's the sound of an approaching celestial body. He actually refers to it as a tariq, which is a term from the Quran sometimes interpreted as a celestial object.
A celestial body. Wow. And how does that connect to the instructions? The prostration, plugging ears?
Well, his rationale is quite unique, maybe even pseudoscientific. He interprets the prostration as the only physical protection.
How so?
He claims it's capable of discharging electromagnetic charges brought by this approaching object. And also, it's the only way, he says, to remain conscious during the intense fear and energy surge it supposedly causes.
And the ears and clothes.
Plugging the ears and wearing thick clothes are presented as protection purely from the expected high sound waves.
So he's applying this kind of physical, maybe even electromagnetic interpretation onto the religious prophecy. Looking even further ahead, the source also discusses the return of a caliphate.
Yes, he suggests the return of the caliphate will happen, but only after a period of oppressive rule. He links it possibly to the awaited figure of the Mahdi.
And he feels this is confirmed.
He states this is a concept he finds confirmed across different traditions he has studied.
And he includes that historical anecdote, too, presumably to back up his approach to taking prophecies literally, the one about Nur al-Din Zengi.
Yes, the interesting story about Prince Nur al-Din Zengi meeting a Jewish priest. The priest, claiming knowledge of holy books and astronomy, supposedly predicts Zengi's victory, but also his death by fever.
And Zengi is skeptical.
Right. But the priest apparently says something like, if you'd read your own Muslim texts, you'd know I'm telling the truth. This anecdote, which the author claims to have found in manuscripts, is presented as evidence that prophecies can be studied and understood factually.
It's clear he views these prophecies not as metaphors, but as literal markers of future unfolding events. Okay, stepping away from the really heavy themes of politics, history, and prophecy for a moment, the source also includes some quite unique observations on language and culture that caught my eye.
Yeah, they definitely add a different flavor to the text.
Right.
For example, the author speculates pretty boldly on the Arabic origins of certain English and Spanish words.
Like which ones?
Well, like the common phrase, okay. He links it to the Andalusian Arabic word waka, which means yes or all right.
Really?
Yeah, and words like war in English, guerra in Spanish, guerrilla. He connects those to Arabic terms like gada, meaning a raid, or kar, meaning attacking and retreating, that kind of hit-and-run tactic.
That's a fascinating, if maybe speculative, linguistic connection he's making there. And he has some pretty dark humor about education, too.
Yes, quite dark. He talks about Arab education systems turning schools into prisons and teaching people to become those with good necks, implying they're just being prepared for subjugation rather than teaching them freedom or critical thinking.
There's also that curious detail he highlights about a specific border situation.
Right, the Spanish-Moroccan borders at Ceuta and Melilla. He finds it really unique and noteworthy that locals from the Moroccan side are allowed to enter these Spanish enclaves relatively freely without visas.
Especially given the economic.
Exactly, especially given the huge economic disparity. He contrasts this very sharply with the heavily restricted borders with Israel, which he notes require intense scrutiny and are only crossed by those with long lives, kind of suggesting how difficult and rare it is.
And another point that seems to tie back to his theme of decline and distraction is the mention of cities famous for vice.
Yes, he revisits that. He points again to cities historically or currently known for things like wine or hashish production, Jerez, Zal again, as symbols of decline and distraction. He draws this historical parallel to the fall of Andalusia, where he claims cities became devoted to winemaking instead of perhaps more useful pursuits.
Okay, so we've really taken a deep dive into this specific viewpoint, haven't we? Presented in Dr. Murad Agha's writings from 2009-2010, it offers a powerful, often quite bleak, but occasionally hopeful picture of the Arab world.
Definitely seen through a lens heavily influenced by historical comparisons, very sharp political critiques, and these detailed religious interpretations of future events.
We've heard his strong condemnations of leadership and systems, a real longing for a glorified Ottoman past, a specific framing of regional conflicts.
And that really granular look at prophecies that he believes point towards major future upheaval and potentially significant change.
The sources give us such a unique look into a particular worldview that was circulating, over a decade ago now. It's just one perspective, of course, among many out there.
But examining it helps us understand the different ways people make sense of the past, the present, and the future in the region. It's valuable for that alone.
And given the source's strong emphasis on both these historical cycles, the rise and fall of empires and these prophetic signs interpreted as literal markers of future events, what does this perspective ultimately suggest about the balance between, say, predetermined destiny and human agency?
That's a great question. Where does the author seem to land on the role of external forces versus internal choices in shaping the destiny of a people? It certainly gives you, the listener, a lot to think about.